Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast. This is episode 7, and we are going to do a sample deconstruction using the construct of religion. Of course, using religion is not a random selection. I think a lot of people could use a little bit of deconstruction when it comes to religion, the construct, and the concept. And we're going to tie this deconstruction to the legislation of morality. So a lot of people have their own definition of religion, but what is it really? And I want to emphasize that we're doing this to sort of bring out the importance of having a good definition. It is the second question, or the second thing that you have to address in the deconstruction process. And we have to understand that having a less than ideal definition will give certain people an advantage, an arbitrary advantage, simply because of the definition. And this is because the definition often will come from a certain subjectivity. And so if you share that same subjectivity, then that definition will be to your advantage. And obviously, if you do not share that subjectivity, then that definition will could potentially be disadvantageous to you. Now, it depends, and as we go through this discussion, you'll see that, especially these days in the United States, things have taken a different turn. So, because you can have an advantage, an arbitrary advantage, simply through the definition, we need to reset definitions. Now, I know a lot of people feel nervous that only certain people can decide what a definition is, but hey, I think that if you want to have a conversation, then we have to come to a mutual understanding. And so this coming to a mutual understanding, an agreed understanding, and an agreed subjectivity, we need to reset subjective perspective, so that instead of two competing subjectivities trying to gain advantage on the other, we're just going to try to have or reach a common perspective. And we're going to try to do this through the definition. And having a good definition will help us also to avoid hypocrisy. And we're going to see how that comes up later on. So the traditional understanding of religion that one will encounter has the notion or the concept of a deity, a god, or a higher power within that understanding of religion. And so therefore, if you do not believe in some kind of higher power or a god, then you're not really religious. Okay, that is the general understanding that one will encounter today. What's interesting is that that understanding of religion, that there must be some sort of deity, is a specific subjective perspective. An interesting article that was written by Renato Rosaldo, he's a sociologist, he wrote an article called After Objectivism. And it was really interesting about this article is that he listed some examples of early religious studies. And part of the definition that they were using of religion was that there had to have been rituals, right? Repeated rituals, which will give you a hint or let you know that what you are observing is religious. And so a lot of Europeans, when they would go perhaps to colonize or subjugate other parts of the world, one of the things that they would try to study first is the religious beliefs of those people. This is the common understanding that a lot of people have when it comes to religious history. So how do you know what you're looking at is religious or not? Well, if they're repeated rituals, then that's going to be religion. And you can kind of see that this would be somewhat problematic. And this problem was sort of made fun of in 1956 by an ethnographer called, his name was Horace Minor, and he wrote an article called The Nasarima, about the Nasarima and their mouth rights. And it was kind of a tongue-in-cheek kind of joke, if you will, sort of to make fun of his own field, but at the same time, maybe knowingly or unknowingly, illustrated the problematic nature of observing other people to try to understand what their religion was. Nasarima is just simply American spelled backwards, and the mouth rites that he was describing, this religious ritual that he was describing, was just simply the act of brushing one's teeth. And so the point of Rosaldo's article was that a lot of these religious scholars thought that they were observing religion, but really what they were doing was observing culture. And so they just basically created religion by mistaking cultural practices for religious practices. Well, one could do the same thing except flip everything, right? So Rosaldo said everything is culture. There is no such thing as religion. And so we can flip it in another way because of mathematical principle and just basically say everything is religion. And so whatever anyone thought is culture, no, that's actually religious. And so if you look at it that way, that everything is religious, then any kind of narrower definition will marginalize, exclude, or give some sort of advantage to a person or to a group of people, right? So you can see how that works, right? So by having everything as religious, then you have to examine everything. So if you say, let's talk about religion, and you have a very narrow, specific definition of religion, some people in the room, especially if it's a classroom, are not going to be included into the conversation. And by being excluded, they'll either take it as a matter of pride, or they will be hurt by being marginalized. You know, some people will feel inferior, some people will feel superior. And also, by a definition, one can determine what is going to be considered religious and what is not religious. A popular topic these days, perhaps, is taxes, right? So a lot of people in the United States believe that taxes, that paying a tax is not necessarily a religious act. But if you look at even Christian scripture, you'll see that there are discussions with regard to tax, paying one's taxes. And so one could say in a very, very broad, general kind of way that because scripture addresses it, for a lot of people, the question about paying taxes was resolved 2,000 years ago. And so no one really thinks about it these days, unless you're Amish, right? And so the Amish, when they started, when they were told they had to pay Social Security taxes, they were like, why? Our culture, our society, our little enclave here, we have a system set up so that we don't need to pay any kind of Social Security tax because we'll never collect on it. And so they fought against the government and finally got an exemption from paying the Social Security tax in 1965 because it was a religious thing. All right. And so I'm trying to get you to realize that this understanding that everything is can be tied to religion one way or another. And so what would be a better definition of religion instead of belief in a deity or some kind of ritualized practice? My definition that I offer to you, which is incredibly inclusive and broad and general, is simple. It's just a system of belief. Religion is just a system of belief. Now, some of you might say, oh, it has to be a system. Systems can be simple or complex. If you understand what a system is, it can be very, very simple. It doesn't even have to be logical. It doesn't have to be rational. It just has to mean something to the person who has that belief. Because that person is going to use that belief to make decisions, to make choices. And so one can see that whatever they believe, that person believes is true, becomes kind of a moral code. So you can see that some people prioritize football and all of their decisions from their employment, their vacation time, where they spend their money, what kind of clothes they wear revolves around football. I would argue that people like that prioritize football more than any belief in any deity. You can also see this phenomena in nationalism and even atheism, right? So the belief that there is no God is a belief. And because of that belief in there being no God, they will make certain choices. They will avoid certain people. They will try to get closer to other people. In other words, everyone has a belief, right? They believe something is true. Now, some of you might be saying at this point that I'm being absurd. I'm being too broad. I'm so broad that there's no new information here. You can't do anything with it. However, I would push back and say, by having this broad definition, this all-inclusive definition, we don't have to do what Robert Bella did in 1967. In 1967, he looked around and he said, there are a lot of things we do here in America that looks exactly like religious practices, but we can't call it religion. So he came up with this expression, civil religion, which is kind of an absurd expression, right? A non-religion religion. So it looks like religion, but we can't call it religion because then a lot of people will start having debates and conflict over whether a practice of nationalism will conflict with their own religious beliefs, right? And so you have that kind of conundrum created as a result of this very narrow understanding, traditional understanding of religion, which goes away with this definition of system of belief. Now, having a very broad definition, if we just play along, right, and just try to sit on it a little bit, let it stew in our brains, by having this very broad definition, there are benefits to this. Not only do we avoid certain kind of problematic situations like the civil religion phenomena, but we can also watch and observe people who come along and say, oh no, that definition of system of belief is too broad. Here's a better one. And that definition is narrower. When someone comes along with a narrower definition, you can see the work of that definition with this reset perspective. In other words, when you have and established and understand this broad definition, and someone else comes along and gives you a narrower one, you understand why they're doing it, right? You see what they're targeting. You see what their agenda is. You see what their assumptions are, if you think about it, right? And so having a broad definition first, and then looking at these narrower definitions that are floating around all over the world, you see what they're up to. Also, you begin to see the hypocrisy that generally arises as a result of these narrower definitions. So this idea of civil religion, so we're going to say that this is not religion, so everyone's got to do it, but this is religion, so only some people can do it. You have that kind of weird function. And so through definitions, you can create labels, and labels then determine what people are supposed to do, required to do, etc. And we can see this kind of debate all throughout society. Also, we begin to understand this phenomena of fanaticism, right? Religious fanaticism. Oh, that person's a fanatic. They're a danger to society. Really? So someone who is really over the top crazy about football, so much so that they will beat up fans from another team who dares wear their jersey, their favorite team jersey, in your stadium. Oh, I have to fight that person, right? That's fanaticism too. But people don't recognize it as religious fanaticism because it's sport. Me, and with my reset perspective, I see that it is basically the same type of behavior one will see in religious groups. You can see the same behavior in science fields. You can see it in political fields, particularly between the different political parties. You can see it in nationalistic beliefs, environmental beliefs, etc. It goes on. The list is endless. So once you take away the prejudice and the subjectivity that comes along with prior knowledge, with what we were socialized to know and understand, and how we are supposed to understand it from the past and from our education, you begin to see more connections. You begin to see more relationships. And therefore, this is the way that we begin to see hypocrisy running through society. Also, by having this broad understanding of religion, you begin to realize that when people become politically active, right, engage in political activism, and they push to have a certain legislation passed, what they're doing is they're imposing their subjective view, their perspective on everybody else, right? So they're normalizing their perspective at the same time criminalizing and disallowing, criminalizing alternate subjectivities. And this is what happens in political activism. Now, questions of the separation of church and state often will come up. I'm going to try to wrap this up soon, so hang in there. But separation of church and state, a lot of people ignore what it originally meant, right? The not using tax money to subsidize religious organizations. That was the original meaning of separation of church and state. Today, it means that certain religious groups are not allowed to turn into legislation their religious beliefs. But if everything is religion, then anytime someone says, we have to do this, something must be done, that should be illegal, those people shouldn't be allowed to do that. Whenever we do that, we are expressing our belief. And if we turn that belief into legislation, we are legislating hypocrisy, right? We are criminalizing alternate subjectivities and normalizing and legalizing one. And so in this process, you can see that all legislation has a coercive character to, well, excuse me, 99.9% of legislation has a coercive character and nature to it. Legislation of morality reduces choices. There's no more discussion any longer. There's no attempt to persuade other people. And you can see this carrying over from the discussion I had in the very first episode, where people have a need to win. And because they can't win through dialogue, they're going to win through legislation. And part of winning, the winning process, is eradication of the opposition, of alternate competing subjectivities. So this legislation of morality, as I already said, is the criminalization of choice. It's the criminalization of subjectivity. It is hypocrisy built into the law. So therefore, it is no surprise that the more society becomes politically active, the more people become engaged politically, the more hypocrisy there is in society. And as I said very early in the first or second episode, hypocrisy is the root of injustice. So people who think that they are doing something that's good are kind of mystified how, through their good intentions, injustice increases in society. They are not seeing the results that they thought that they would have. So in conclusion, everyone should be allowed their beliefs, but each person must pay the cost of the choices that they want to make. And part of that cost is the consequence of those choices, right? And once we do that, then we realize that there are a lot of choices which may not be the best optimal choice. Now, some of you might be saying, oh, so you don't want certain people to have, be able to make certain choices. Look, if you really believe in something as being true, you will be willing to pay the price of those choices. It means that you will have to make sacrifices in other aspects of your life, but because you know that it's true, you believe that it's true, you are willing to bear that cost and continue to believe in those things. But if it turns out that you really didn't believe it anyway, in the first place, you were just kind of going along with the crowd, then you're going to look for alternatives that you are willing to pay for, right? And then take responsibility for the consequences. That's it for this exercise in deconstruction. I will see you in the next episode.